Well, thanks, Jamie. I appreciate the introduction. This morning to kind of kick off the IT funnel, I think Stefan and I kind of spent some time talking about what would we like to discuss, and we think it might be a good time to step back and kind of look at the cloud, how you document your decision to move there, your concerns about it, things that we're seeing that are fairly common across financial institutions. Just a little bit of time to just sit back and talk about this transition that's become big. And as you'll see over the next few slides, there's really been a little bit of guidance recently and some things that we felt like hey, it's a great time to talk about. But first, I know there's several folks here maybe that don't know Saltmarsh as an institution very well. So just kind of wanted to recap briefly. We've got offices kind of throughout the Southeast. We've got quite a few offices in Florida, an office in Nashville, Tennessee as well. And of course, we travel all over the country. We have a pretty big practice in financial institutions. It's one of our largest practices. We're also focused on healthcare. We spend a lot of time in the construction side of things. Basically, most of the things that a traditional firm does, and then we have several practices that we go above and beyond. And again, one of the largest practices for us is this. It's dealing with financial institutions. So in kind of stepping back today and thinking about what we would like to discuss, I kind of wanted you to start forming your mind around a couple of things. One is, as you're making a move to, an application, a software, a process to the cloud, I want you to stop and see as we go through these slides, maybe it changes things a little bit. Maybe it's a more significant change than we've all kind of come to believe that it is. So I think you're going to see maybe there's some new risks that you're going to be bringing on. There's some old practices you're going to want to change, and probably some new skills that we're all going to have to figure out. We're all going to have to develop. And of course, today, if you're in this for CPE, we're going to have a couple of code words throughout the process just for you to write down for your CPE credit. First one here is Saltmarsh. Easy one to remember. All right, so, I guess the most important thing perhaps for most any bank presentation is going to be, what is it that the regulators are saying about it? And we actually have a kind of an interesting moment right now. I don't know if it's COVID. I don't know if it's that they were ready to issue the consent order we'll talk about in just a second. But all of a sudden, for the first time since July 2012, we have a joint statement from the FFIEC on the cloud environment. And they'll be the first to say in their guidance, hey, nothing in here is new, and yet some of it is new, and some of the things they choose to reinforce are new. And then most of you probably had a chance to read it and understand it. It goes through the different types of models, if it's SaaS or PaaS or infrastructure as a service. It goes through governance, and a lot of the things they're saying in there are things that we'll try to highlight as well. But I did want to spend a little bit of time maybe talking about one that could have missed your radar screen. The Capital One consent order that came out at the very beginning of August. It is really, in my mind, to my knowledge, the very first consent order I've seen, enforcement action specifically about moving to the cloud. And so there's probably some things that we can gather from it. And what I'll tell you is, I'm sure most of you know, but ultimately this resulted in an $80 million penalty. It's Capital One. They'll be okay. And I know it's specific to who they are and what they did, but there's some things that maybe make sense for us to step back and look at. Because if you can see how the examiners are thinking in one, perhaps you can see how they're thinking in the whole process in general. But some things as you kind of read through it that I want to kind of pull out, and again, we'll develop them a little bit more through the rest of this review, but is that there really seemed to be a focus on, and I know hindsight's 2020, but what did we do when we made the decision to move to the cloud? What did the board direct? How did we do our risk assessment? How do we document the process? How do we verify that audit understands what it is they need to audit now? All of those things kind of came out through this process, going through this enforcement action. It's very interesting in that, there's some school of thought where you have to find a reason why it went wrong. And a lot of the information in the order says, hey, you went through a risk assessment, but you didn't pick up new risks. You went through a process of trying to understand it, but your audit folks may not have known what they were auditing or how they should audit. and maybe your board didn't listen the way that we think they should have listened. A few things kind of fell out that way that I think are worth kind of looking at, reading yourself, and saying, hey, how would this apply to me? Actions I've taken, actions I want to take. And then there's another one in here that's interesting in that, in a way, it's not specifically cloud focused, but it sort of is. It involves vendors. It involves a leak of information. And again, it's another one where information got out and there's some sort of regulatory action to follow. But it's the first that, the New York Department of Financial Services has actually brought their first cybersecurity enforcement action. And while that doesn't apply to most of us, unless we are a state of New York bank, it could be a model for things that are coming. Definitely worth a read. Again, it kind of flows through the process of, and it's very interesting from a cybersecurity perspective, most of the real criticism comes from what did we do once we found out we had an error. And as you read through it, you'll see the things that they're bringing First American Title up on are really specifically on how they responded. So from an incident response perspective, it's pretty interesting as well. But good places to kind of glean what regulators are saying, what they're thinking when you see the actions that they're taking on other institutions. It helps you kind of get a perspective of what the general school of thought may be out there right now.
And one thing I want to make sure people don't miss is these are large organizations, and obviously those are the ones that make the headlines in the press, but all of the concepts that are brought through here are very applicable to every community bank. The items that were listed in the consent order, the items that the New York department brought up, all of those are from the interagency guidance on information security. They're on risk assessment process. They're all on stuff that we're all talking about at community banks as well. So they're very applicable. They're not large size organizations that you can't take those lessons and look at what your examiners are going to look for on a community bank as well.
Excellent point. Right. I mean, take the size, scale it down, but say the concept, it makes sense for you to consider at least. At least read them and know what's going on out there, just in case. So in thinking about, again, kind of some of the key points that perhaps really show through in all of the things we just discussed, and really that we need to be thinking about as institutions when we're making decisions, is maybe to take a step back and say, well, what does the board direct me to do? What do they tell me to do? How do I involve my risk assessment process? How do I flow through to the end? And with that, there's a couple of quick slides here just on maybe as a refresher to kind of step back and say, hey, here's how I need to find out from my board what it is that I should be doing so I can go through the process of determining how to do it most safely. And one thing that I think sometimes I see a fair amount of pushback in talking with institutions is maybe doing some of this very first slide here and going through developing a strategic plan. It's a tough process. You have to go through it every year and kind of update it. There can be great ones and there can be not so great ones. But ultimately, the thinking is, hey, the board is going to sit down, the executive is going to sit down and say, hey, here's what we want to accomplish over the next 5 years. Here's how we want our institution to grow over the next 5 years. And then we'd like to see, and both of these really tie back to your cyber assessment tool when you start looking into the different domains and rising up through the levels, the board to also say, here's what I'm going to give IT. I'm going to give you a strategic plan to see what it is we want to have accomplished over the next 5 years. And I'm also going to give you what's called a risk appetite statement that says, hey, here's the amount of risk we're willing to accept. And those two things then are what we should be able to take in our departments as operations officers, IT officers, and say, okay, now I know what they want me to do. Now I know the risks they want me to take. Let me build my IT strategic plan. And now that one is going to be a biggie, that it gets a specific mention within the guidance from April 2020, and also, again, shows up in your cyber assessment tool. You develop that plan, kind of trying to keep in mind, what is the bank strategic plan, make sure that yours aligns with it, and then you move on to the risk assessment, which is where that risk appetite comes in to say, hey, I've got risk. I go through my risk assessment. Where do I land? It's important to be able to tie back to that risk appetite statement and say, hey, I thought I needed to be a medium. Turns out I'm a high. Does that fit within where I've been asked to stay within? So that's something that, the next slide, we'll really kind of get into the real meat, the tough part, once you kind of decide what it is you want to do, of actually getting through the process safely of making a change, making a move.
Yeah, and this is the origin of a lot of the comments we're seeing in financial institutions in the last couple of years. Is the examiners are really hitting on that concept of risk appetite. They want to see that there is a set risk appetite set by the board. They want to see that stretch all the way to the risk assessment, so that we can see not only a statement of the risk, but a statement of, is that risk within or not within the current risk appetite? And if it's not within the current risk appetite, of course, they're going to want to see a plan for additional mitigation. But there should be some established purpose of why you're adding this mitigation, and generally it should fall back to that not currently being within the risk appetite. But it even rolls further into your controls and the testing of your controls, because if it's within the risk appetite because of the mitigation of the controls, we're want to make sure those controls are effective and provide the mitigation expected, because if they're not, then we go back to, well, it's no longer within the risk appetite. So that is a key concept that is relatively new for community banks, but is definitely heavily hammered upon right now.
Absolutely. And I guess, again, kind of coming back to what we just mentioned, is if you're going through the risk assessment process and you don't know what risk is acceptable, how do you determine, other than just mitigate everything to low, which is a really tough thing to do if you don't have that appetite to sit in front of you and say, okay, I know what they want to accomplish. I know what risk they're willing to accept. I go through my risk assessment. It helps me determine if I have to go back and say, we can't do it. We can't do it the way that you set it out. Or if I can say, all right, I've been able to do it.
And if you have a higher risk appetite in a certain area, that should tie back to your strategic plan. And the reason why you're willing to take a little extra risk there as a board is because you expect to take that and leverage it into some kind of strategic advantage.
Right. So, now we get into the real actually documenting and going through the process, and really a lot of what I think, if you look back at the Capital One regulatory concern, really where we're going to kind of discuss some of the things that they brought up there, for example. So, we all know the risk assessment process. I know it is frustrating. We feel like we're always risk assessing everything, every decision we make. And the answer to every question is that you do a risk assessment. And I would encourage you, yes, I know it can be tiring and it can be frustrating, but there can be value in the process. And I hope that you'll take the time and kind of go through the process, especially from a cloud perspective, as you're making a move. And again, we'll try to tie it back to that consent order a little bit, that make it count. If you're going to have to go through the process, make it count. So in going through the risk assessment specifically, if we look back at what happened in that order, they said, hey, you started with a risk assessment, but you didn't actually assess risks that were specific to your new environment. So maybe the thing to think about is, do I have the risk assessment the way I need it to be? Are there new risks that I've got to go through and try to figure out what they may be, what they may not be, before I sit down and go through a risk assessment? I may not be able to use the one I used last year for something else. Maybe things have changed a little bit. And then, the flow as it normally goes, you go through it and you say, hey, I found it, it's a medium, and medium's not good enough. I'm going back to my risk appetite. I need to be a low. What are my mitigating controls? I've got those in place. I've mitigated them. Makes sense. Normal flow process. And something else that seems to be coming up here and looking through this guidance is that, wait a minute, now I'm going to hand it off to audit. Now that I've done this process and I've gotten through it, I'm going to hand it off to audit. Do I need to look at them and make sure that they have the knowledge and the capacity to understand what it is we're doing, to understand the controls we've implemented, the ability to test those controls? And that was something that did show up, is, you didn't get the audit scope right, and you didn't have people that knew what they were auditing doing the audits. I mean, those are important things to be paying attention to. Assuming we've got that, then the next process and the step is, okay, audit goes through their review, and they say, hey, here's some things that we think you need to do. We want you to implement those recommendations. Specifically, when you look at the First American order from DFS, it was that they knew about the weakness. There had been a scan that showed the weakness, but they really had kind of put it on the back burner. They didn't quite understand what the risk was there. So instead of only making it a short amount of time, there was quite a few months where millions of records were available. So again, even when there is a finding, you got to make sure you understand the recommendation and start working on implementing those. And then it's just a circular process. I know it's frustrating to see that wheel on there, but it seems like you're always kind of going back through that. Risk assess again, try again, go through these processes. So that's kind of a couple of these last two slides really, I think our intent is to say, I believe when folks come in and ask you about how did you make the decision to move there, you're going to need a book. You're going to need some work. You're going to need to be able to hand people something that's sizable and say, hey, here's all the way from top down, from the board all the way to the last audit that was done, showing how we got to our decision point, how we determined we needed something, how we mitigated our risk, and how we are where we are today. And we're happy and open for you to tell me what else that we need to change.
Yeah, that key section there, assessing your audit knowledge and capacity, that was something that was addressed in a couple of those documents we provided there. And it's something I don't see being done oftentimes in the smaller community banks. And it's not that there's a long, lengthy process, but I think there needs to be some documentation of that process. I think it's conceptually thought of. There's probably some discussion that happens, but we don't see it documented. And even if you get it documented into your audit committee minutes or your IT steering committee minutes, make sure there's some place that you can point to that you went through the process to assess both the audit process, whether it's internal or using a third party, what the capacity of that area is, and what the knowledge and experience of that area is to cover these new products. Because as cloud products roll in, just as our vendors are getting used to them, we're getting used to them, the auditors are getting used to them too. And there's a different way to audit. There's different things that you got to look at and different risk. So making sure that concept is included both in your consideration when you're going to these new implementations, but also in your documentation to show when the examiners come, as Jason mentioned, that you did in fact go through that process. That's again, as the old saying is, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. Well, we got to find out a way to make sure we're documenting that to establish that we're following that process. And there should be an impact to audit scope when there's major systems that are changed. Wherever systems are changed, I would always expect to see a change in the audit scope that's going to pick up that coverage. That's something that there's a new control in place that's going to be added in the audit scope. Some kind of way I can demonstrate that we've updated that process to include these new systems.
Absolutely. So then I think here we just kind of want to stop and say, hey, here's a few things that we've had to stop and think about, over the last year or so as we're watching more and more folks kind of make that move. And not, again, in the financial world, we've been slow and methodical about the move. We've kind of been waiting for things to ripen to the point that we feel they're safe enough. And very few people are fully in the cloud, but we're all slowly kind of picking up a new vendor here or there, and we're getting there. And in some cases, we are there. Some of us have made that move. But something that I think is important, and Stephen kind of alluded to it a minute ago, and again, it kind of goes back to maybe some of the weaknesses that were in the orders that we discussed, is there's probably a skills gap. There may be a skills gap. Even when you outsource to a vendor, there could be a skills gap. Internally, there may be a skills gap. I mean, this is just a new environment for us. It's a new way of managing things. And, it's important to point out, I think perhaps it's very important to point out that simply because you've used a provider in the past, that may not mean to do a service for you. That may not mean that they fully understand the cloud or what to look for there as well. I mean, I know, for example, with us at Saltmarsh, we've, a year ago, were we doing scans of cloud environments? We weren't, but we see the needs there, and we've moved into vulnerability scans of the cloud world as well. We're all kind of growing on that skills gap. We're trying to get there, but we just want to make sure that you stop and say, okay, do I have what I need to manage it? If I'm going to be the person managing it in the cloud, and if I don't, how do I get there? Develop a roadmap, develop some sort of process for you to be educated yourself. And if I'm going with a vendor, how do I kind of get comfortable? And we'll talk about that a little bit here in a minute, but how do I get comfortable that they know what they're doing? Because they were great at doing this thing in the past for me. That may not mean they're great at doing a managed environment for me in the cloud. Who else are they using? How do I get comfortable with their skills as well? The other thing that I think, kind of to point out here, and I suspect when Stephen does a little more discussion on Office 365 in a little bit, it'll maybe become more apparent. But I think in most of these platforms that we may move to that are in the cloud, sometimes they come out of the box and the configuration is not always security minded. It's just, we're trying to make it easy to use. Companies are trying to make it easy to use. And in some cases, just because that's the way it comes out, there may be several things that you need to educate yourself on and look what else could be selected. And the same thing, again, going back to the previous point, has your vendor educated themselves and decided, okay, I'm using this new cloud environment from this company. have I made sure that these configurations are security specific, not just user friendly? And then something that I suspect we're all going to have to spend more time on that we really haven't in the past is, and I'm guilty of it, I think we're all guilty of it, is getting a SOC report, rolling through it when we're trying to evaluate a vendor, saying, hey, they didn't have any real concerns. Yes, they have complementary user entity controls. They seem reasonable. We're good. But as you start to think about it, as you push yourself out to the cloud and you put yourself in the hands of that vendor, those controls are really all that you have a lot of control over. After you get through the contracting process, what's left really is, am I doing everything that they've asked me to do in their SOC report that I must do to protect myself? And so I think you may want to start thinking about what way can I validate, not just that I've read the complementary controls and that I understand them, but that I'm actually following them. There may need to be a review process, an audit process that says, I'm checking that in my annual testing to make sure that I really am doing the things that they're asking me to do. Because otherwise, everything else, all bets are off. And then something, again, that I think flowed through looking at the regulatory items, and also it just makes sense as you step back and start to think about it, is your policy and your procedures and the way that you have written and developed an information security program, it may change a lot. Every time you take on a new vendor and you push something else to the cloud, you may need to step back and say, I know we already talked about the risk assessment. Maybe there's new risks for me to consider, but my IT policy, maybe I don't handle break fix the way I used to. Maybe I don't handle certain things the way I used to. Step back and make sure that policy, look at your information security program. Does it really encompass things no longer being just managed here, 5 feet away from me? I can grab the box and unplug it if I need to. Does it kind of go through the process of understanding, hey, it's in the cloud now. Does it make sense anymore? Your disaster recovery plan, we've got a whole slide on that later, but is that changed? I can't just recover myself. I have to worry about other people that have impact into my environment now. How are they recovering themselves? An incident response plan. Again, for better or for worse, you're going to maybe have partners in your response for incident because you now have your information elsewhere. You have partners elsewhere. And then I know we've hit it, so we won't belabor the point, but the audit risk and the process that you go through the audit, it may have changed fundamentally by the way that you've moved things around. Something else to consider is, okay, I'm shifting a lot of my risk into the cloud. Is my insurance going to cover me if there's a problem there? Or am I, through the contracting process, making sure that my vendor has a pretty solid ironclad policy that covers me if they make a mistake? And again, that probably will go back to your complementary user controls if there is some sort of issue later to prove that you did everything you were supposed to do. And then, something else that just kind of comes up, how do you get comfortable your data is gone? Be thinking through that process. When you do want to move away from a vendor and you want them to wipe all traces of you and you go to somebody else, and that's something in theory the cloud is going to allow us to do, is to move back and forth more easily if we want to. How do I get comfortable with where my data, one, is, making sure it's the places they told me it would be, and then two, once it's gone from there, that it's gone, that it can't be recovered by them later. So I said we talk about disaster recovery, and I think maybe it makes sense to spend a little time on it because maybe others are different, but I often hear, well, I've got Microsoft, I've got AWS. If they've got a problem, we've all got problems. And, I think it's important to step back and say it's still yourself on the line, your institution on the line. Are you comfortable as you've built an environment where data can be recovered, where you can get back up and running? And I know that's harder to do, but just like you would in your home environment, I would like you to step back and say, okay, have I created a single point of failure? Is there some vendor that really is my primary point of failure? And what am I going to do about it? Accept the risk, go through the board and say, hey, this is the best we can do, accept the risk. Am I going to create some other process to back up our data? And then, again, moving back to kind of that first part, and here's a little excerpt in here just from, from a Microsoft contract. It's available. You look it up online, but they're saying, hey, everybody sometimes has disruptions. Everybody sometimes has outages, and we're going to do our best, and they do a good job, but we're going to do our best to make sure we can get you back up and running, but we can't guarantee your data is going to be there. We suggest that you back up your data. How many contracts like that have you signed and not thought about what is really my backup process past them? And even maybe scarier in a way, how many vendors are you using that has signed that contract for you on your behalf to provide the service to you that may not have developed a process to back that up? It's one of those things that doesn't happen until it happens, but when it does, we're all going to wish we had that data back. And then, again, we mentioned it a minute ago, but as far as recovery plans go, take a step back and make sure that your process now makes sense with your new environment. So I suspect that we'll spend a good amount of time here in probably what most of us have been watching for and listening for, because it's such a commonly used service at institutions, is, well, talk to me about Office 365. Talk to me about your concerns with it. Talk to me about things that you've noticed, things that I should change or do or be thinking about. And something I'd like to bring up here is, I think many of you know, but if you don't, Salt Marshall runs its own MSP. We provide, technology services for other types of companies. We don't do it for banks because we're trying to, manage our independence there. But we have quite a bit of experience with it. And I think that makes probably Stephen a little bit more uniquely qualified than the average person to step back and say, hey, here's some things that I've noticed that concern me. And I think he's a big fan of the product, but kind of going back to, the configurations, it's yours. Your tenant, it's yours. You've got to be thinking about how you set it up, how you manage it. Stephen, you mind sharing some things that you found and maybe kind of pointing us in the direction? I know you've got a list that you'll share with us later, perhaps, but that'll give some other suggestions as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's Office 365 is a great example of cloud technology that seems to become more and more pervasive in the community banking area. I mean, most of the banks seem to hold off on it for quite a long time, but now it seems they're adopting it, at just a rapid rate. And the bad side of that is we're seeing people getting attacked by that in an amazing rate. I mean, it's happening every day. People are compromising Office 365, and we hear about these hacks in Office 365, and some people translate that into being that's not a secure platform, but really that's not the case. The case is that in every situation that I've reviewed, which has been several, it's always been an issue of configuration, a weakness in configuration that allowed a user to give access to something they shouldn't have been able to give access to, a weakness in configuration that left open a door that shouldn't have been open, but it's all come down to implementation. And really, it's no different than any of the other cloud technologies that we've dealt with, and some of the things that Jason mentioned earlier, that it's very important that the person who's administering that and the provider, the service provider we use to help us with it is well educated and used to that platform and knows how to secure it. And it kind of comes back to the point you made about the SOC reports that we see, and many times on cloud products I'll see people say, well, it's a secure, we have a secure product, here's the AWS SOC report, and we use AWS, so we're secure. And the truth of the matter is, just like saying we use AWS, so we're secure is not valid. Neither is we use Office 365 is not secure. Well, both those platforms have SOC reports. Both those platforms are able to be deployed in a secure manner, but it takes management and configuration to set it up in a secure manner. And Microsoft, much to my chagrin, is still following their old process of let's just make it work, and that's great. I mean, for their sales process, that's great. It works out of the box, and anyone can turn it on and click a few buttons, and next thing you know, they've got mail flowing, and it's magic, and they're connecting their phones, and all this stuff's happening. But the way they make it easy to make it work is they leave all these doors open, so no matter what you might need, it's available. And and the hackers know this, and they know this very well, and so they in turn also know the ones that aren't being used very often, and that's generally a place where they spend a lot of their time looking for threat vectors that are open, looking for ways that they can attack that implementation. As Jason mentioned earlier, we have had to adjust our audit process to include cloud services in several ways, but we've gotten much more specific in the 365 offering, just because there's so much of a reliance on that in our client base, that we've actually developed an entire process just to audit Office 365 and that tenant, and that comes everything from Azure Active Directory, to the typical Office 365 components of mail and Teams and all the different things that they're using within that platform. It's just so pervasive now into the information systems of the institution that it's necessitated a specific audit process for that. But just out of the box, and as Jason mentioned, we do have a document that both we use in our MSP, and then oftentimes share with our clients if they would like us to share it. And if you guys would like to get a copy of it, if you contact us, we'll send you out a copy of the document that we use. But really, it's just a checklist of best practices that we go through to say, hey, make sure we've made this adjustment on every single new tenant that we set up on Office 365, or every new tenant we bring on as a client, because we see so often it's not being done. And some of it is, the very basic one. The number one is multi-factor authentication. Absolutely, you need to have multi-factor authentication implemented on any Office 365, any Office 365 tenant that's in use. I've heard lots of arguments against it. None of them I've found valid, quite frankly. People are concerned about the difficulty of use. Remember, that we got to think about what those multi-factors are. It's, something you have, something you know, and something you are. There are 3 factors, right? Well, you got to have 2 of those to have multi-factor. Well, oftentimes I remind people, well, a corporate computer is something you have. A password is something you know. So if you want to do multi-factor authentication and help shortcut the backlash from your user base, turn that computer into something that you have. So, put a certificate on it. Through your certificate authority, create an internal certificate authority, register that certificate, then look for that certificate as part of your multi-factor authentication and the conditional access policies. So that means that if Jason logs in, we know it's Jason because he's got a password, so that's something he knows, but he's on a Saltmarsh laptop because I've registered that and it has a certificate on it. Well, then I know that's something he has. I've got those 2 pieces. I don't have to do a multi-factor authentication every time. You can tie that back to, again, conditional access policies that says, hey, if he's done that and he's authenticated with his multi-factor authentication and it's a Saltmarsh machine, well, then he doesn't have to in the future on that machine put anything but a password. So that really lowers the burden of the multi-factor for your user base, because that means that any of your own corporate controlled devices, they're not getting hit with that multi-factor authentication every time. However, if they decide to go to their aunt's house in Nebraska, and then if you allow this in your tenant, and they can go to the web-based mail and check their mail, well, even that web-based mail, it's going to pop them with a multi-factor request. And there's very friendly ways to do it now. People have asked, what's the best multi-factor? Is it the tokens? Is it no, the best one is the one people will use. That's honestly the case. I mean, yes, I've read about vulnerabilities about thwarting phone-based multi-factor authentication and hijacking SIM cards and all these kind of things. But I got to tell you, I haven't seen it happen in the wild, at least not in our client-based level organizations. I'm sure there's some persistent state actors that are out there doing that to high-level targets. But the truth is, the one that people will use is what's best, and what we've seen in our user bases is things that will go off of their cell phone, whether it's a text message to their cell phone or a phone call to their cell phone. People have these cell phones attached to themselves. They're always carrying it with them. They won't forget them. They don't lose them like they do the little tokens. So that makes it a very strong device to use when you're trying to identify it's them. So wrapping in a multi-factor authentication through the phone can be done in a couple different ways. They can put the application on there, so it literally just pops up on their phone with a button for them to hit approve. It can be via a phone call where they call on, and hit 1, or they can actually have a display code. They type it in. There's lots of options. But the point is, work with those options, work with your user base. It's not as intrusive as people try to make it out to be. It actually becomes very simple, and most people are used to it on most systems anyway. If they're not getting it at your office, they're getting it, somewhere else. There's other places in their life they're having to do multi-factor, so it's not such a foreign issue. The typical pushback I get is, well, we can't have a teller having to do it every time they have to log in from a screen. That's an option that you set. You can make sure that they don't have to do that every time their screen locks. You can make sure that it's a machine that's in your location. But make sure that you have multi-factor authentication, and make sure that it is a requirement for any type of remote access, whatever that may be. I've even advised organizations that only allow internal access to Office 365. So they have Office 365. They use conditional access, which is something I strongly recommend that you all educate yourself on, and that is a very, very powerful portion of Office 365. But they'll use conditional access to require the logins to only come from their locations. They'll pin it to their static IP addresses or other manners to require it to come from their locations. and then not turn on multi-factor. And I think that's the wrong approach, because as we know, layers work best, right? So if you implement a process where there's only internal access, which some of our institutions do that, still require multi-factor for anything outside. And I know that's contradicting, right? Why require multi-factor for outside if I only require inside? Well, the answer is because if there's a problem, if they are able to spoof the IP address, if there's some other method that comes on the outside, or if you have a virus that goes across the world and suddenly you have to send everybody home for a week and now you're overnight remote, well, you already have those multi-factor things in place. So implement multi-factor. That's the number one. I know I've spent a lot of time on just saying multi-factor authentication should be enabled, but that's absolutely important, and it thwarts, depending on which expert you ask, some say 70%, somebody say 95%, whatever the percentage is. It's a very high percentage of current threats are thwarted simply by Office 365. It's quite amazing to me how many people are attacking that, even to cell phones now. I'm sure some of you guys have gotten these cell phone phishing attempts. I got one today, as a matter of fact, that actually texted me saying that it had a package that was supposed to be delivered in last month or something like that, and click on this link to verify the delivery of this package. When I clicked on that link, it presented me with an Office 365 login. Now, I don't suggest you all click that on your own machines. I do have a burner laptop that I use for those kind of things. It's actually the virtual machine that I pull up, so I can test those kind of links and see where they go, because sometimes I like to do that. I like to just say, hey, let's follow the trail and see where they're going to take me. I certainly don't want to do that on a computer or a phone that's important to me, right? But they were presenting me with an Office 365 login, and so that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to steal your credentials, and if they can get you to log in that way, then they know that they've got an access, and they're going to try to come back into your organization. Many times, if people take this Office 365 further, it's oftentimes used as a single sign-on or additional authentication for some other products too. So sometimes it's not just access to your Office 365, it's also access to your internal domain if you're using AD Sync or Azure Active Directory, or it could be access to many other products that use Office 365 as their single sign-on or SAML solution. But any of those type of threats would be thwarted by having a multi-factor, because they get the username, they get the password, but they're not going to get that multi-factor authentication. And of course, the number two thing is training. Train your users about these security processes, including the multi-factor authentication. I actually did have a user that had made a complaint that they kept getting the multi-factor authentication requests. It kept popping up on their device. Well, it kept popping on their device because someone had gotten their username and password and was trying to log in with their username and password. Well, they kept popping on their device and they kept hitting approve and couldn't figure out why that wasn't stopping it. Well, luckily, the script in that case with that client, the script that the hacker was using was ineffective, and so it was failing anyway. Actually, for another conditional access policy, again, while we do layers, but the initial indication was this user is getting pop-ups for multi-factor authentication. So doing some training to make sure they know, hey, if you're getting those responses and you're not requesting them, the hitting approve is probably not the best option. So training for the users about how to be secure, about how to identify things that may cause a security incident, getting that process in continuous repetitive training to your clients is the number two thing, or your user base, making sure they understand how these things work. The number three thing that I bring up is conditional access. The conditional access policies that they have available within Office 365 is immensely powerful. You can say that the person named Jason can only log in on Wednesdays, and only between 10 and 2, and only from this specific IP address, and only if the sky is blue that day. I mean, there's just so many limitless opportunities to make conditional access policies that you can layer that will make it less likely for a hacker to get in. We did have an incident where we had a hacker that gave up a username and password, or a user that gave up username and password, and it triggered a conditional access policy because the username and password was correct, but they hit that conditional access policy because they're actually coming from a foreign location, which of course they could proxy and get around that, but they didn't know we had this policy, obviously. They hit that conditional access, it alerts the help desk, telling the help desk that someone's trying to log into this account from this foreign country. They never got the multi-factor, although they would have got that next. The layer of the application of these security policies that hit conditional access first, so it stopped them right there, but it also notified the help desk, which also notifies now we've got a user with a compromised username and password, so we can do something about that, which is, of course, invalidate the password and make the change. But the layers there are incredibly important, and conditional access is next to multi-factor authentication. Conditional access is the most powerful thing you have to secure your Microsoft Office 365 tenant. So use that. Try to bring that down as tight as possible. If you don't have users traveling to foreign countries, which most of you probably don't have that on a regular basis, go ahead and put that as your first conditional policy. Must be from your state. You can even go down that low. Now, as we all know, those aren't perfect, but again, we're talking layers, so make sure you put that in there. The next thing is to make sure you disable shell access. I do not know why Microsoft by default gives everybody PowerShell access, but in 95% of all the hacks I've seen, that's exactly what happens. The hacker gets the username and password. They hit the tenant with a PowerShell command, and they're running PowerShell scripts. They're not in the email interface, clicking and doing one transaction at a time. No, they're running PowerShell scripts because it's probably some script kid. He doesn't even know what he's doing. He knows when he gets in, he runs this script, and that script does whatever that script does. Well, what that script does is harvest contacts, send out emails, look for other pathways. If it's a malware attack, it's going to look for file shares. It has a process that it does, but they're running that all through PowerShell. And so there's no reason for a user to have PowerShell access. And in my opinion, there's no reason for an administrator to generally have PowerShell access open. So, my suggestion is disable PowerShell access for everyone except for an administrator account that's going to have a conditional access policy that says it's only allowed to come from inside your network. Now, you may have to open it and close it if you have some needs for some remote help on something, and that's fine. Do it for that incident. But on a regular basis, your conditional access should say that user has no access except from your actual inside your organization, and only that user has live conditional or script PowerShell access. It's just not needed by any users, and admins need it on a rare occasion. So let them turn it on when they need it and turn it off when they don't. For admins and for users, they shouldn't have it. It's that simple. The other thing is being aware of who has access to your tenant. One of the the easy ways to do this, and I'm certainly guilty of this. We manage a lot of different organizations' tenants, as part of on our MSP side. Well, oftentimes we'll have a new client or a client about one portion of what we're doing, and the first thing we do if they have a question about Office 365 is we send them a tenant request, and basically what that does when they click and authorize it, that makes us a partner listed on their tenant account, which gives us full administrative access to their tenant. Anything in their Microsoft tenant we can now do. We can create a global admin, we can disable a global admin, we can do all these things, and many people don't realize that. And so sometimes they'll have old partners or partners that were only there for perhaps to give them a proposal. I've seen that. They're going to give them a proposal on Teams phone implementation, and as part of that proposal, they're doing a little a search of the Office 365 tenant to find out what kind of licenses they need and that kind of stuff. So they'll send a partner. They join the partner. That person gives them a proposal. Maybe the organization doesn't go with that particular vendor, and they don't do the implementation, or they do it with somebody else, and they forget that in their tenant is this partner that's attached to them. And who knows what that partner does as far as their employment practices and this kind of stuff, because they never thought through that process before they gave them access. But be aware what you're doing when you're allowing partners in your tenant. And I suggest all of you go back to your tenant right now and look and say, hey, what partners are attached to my tenant and what access do they have? Because I think many times people are surprised when they say, oh, I forgot that guy was there, or I don't know why that guy's there. So getting that out. But of course, doing that with your global admins and your regular administrative users, people are more used to that process. So generally, I see people keeping a pretty good tight case on that. But that is also something you want to make sure you're doing, reducing the number of global admins to the ones that are necessary, and making sure you're aware of who they are. I also suggest avoiding vendors that allow a singular or a shared user to your global admin. That to me is always a red flag. When you have a shared user to a global admin, in your tenant that's remotely accessible, that's a problem. Again, if you got to have a shared user, if you got to have a global admin, use those conditional access policies to require that access to come from one location or two locations. Of course, the danger in setting all this up, if you start narrowing yourself down too much, you can lock yourself out. So be mindful of that, and think about your disaster recovery locations when you're putting these things in. So make sure when you restrict it to just your location, maybe just your location and your disaster recovery location, but make sure that you're limiting it where you can. There is a long ways you can do it. Look at your Microsoft security score. Now, when I say look at it, I don't say live by it, because that thing changes every day. I think it's just really difficult to keep up with what Microsoft is doing there. On this platform, I think Microsoft's done a tremendous job of continuously adding new features, and that's wonderful. But it's also one of the downsides. They add features so fast, it's very hard for administrators to keep up with the security on that process. So make sure that you're looking at that security score, seeing what they're putting out for new recommendations, and determining whether that's applicable for you or not. Some of them are more applicable than others, but at least be aware of what's happening there. But also get enrolled and make sure you're getting the Microsoft updates for Office 365. They'll send administrative updates to you. They'll tell you ahead of time which things are changing. There's usually one a week that comes out. And most of the time it's minor changes, but sometimes it's large changes. I mean, yesterday one came out that said they're enabling the process for end users to be able to sync their lists between their corporate accounts and their personal accounts. Traditionally that's been automatically blocked. You can't share from a corporate account to a personal account. Well, for some reason, somewhere in Microsoft's wisdom, they decided that was a good thing to happen. It's in a small note in the updates that are coming out that came in the admin email that I got, I think it was yesterday or the day before, that said, hey, this is what we're going to enable. And you as administrator can disable it, but this is how you got to disable it. So let me tell you how to disable it. But the default, if you do nothing, if you didn't read that email, then starting tomorrow or whatever the date is on it, I think it's actually on September 1st, your users can now sync their lists from their corporate account to their personal account. Now, many organizations don't use lists, and so maybe that's not a big deal. But understanding your organization and how that applies to you is important. But even if it's not a big deal, if your organization doesn't use lists, then disable that access. People say, well, it's not a big deal, we don't use lists. Well, some user could, and you don't know about it. If you don't use it, that's another thing you can disable. Disable the feature altogether, or at least disable the syncing outside your organization. You want to make sure that you're controlling that process. But that's the central theme, all about Office 365. There's all of these features. If you're not using them, turn them off. They're just a potential threat vector that's unnecessary. This whole process of these updates that happen so fast, it's very hard to manage. That's what I look for. Every time I see one of those updates, I look and say, what's the new feature? What's the process to turn it off? And I start with turning it off. That's my first step. Let's turn it off, and let's talk about how we can turn it on in a safe manner. But that's where I would start. The other thing is looking at logging and auditing. We've all had in the traditional on-premise Active Directory some good recommendations of what things should be logged and what shouldn't, and those out of the boxes don't have a lot of the logging turned on, as you probably all know. Well, that's no different in Office 365. Much of the logging and auditing is turned off. You need to get in there and turn that on. Otherwise, you won't have the ability to look back on things that happened in the past. Again, on that form that I'll send out if you guys request it, I'll tell you what we recommend as far as what auditing and logging to turn on. You really don't have the space consideration anymore. When it's in the cloud, they deal with the space issue, so it's not a problem to do the logging. You do have to pay a little bit extra for the mailbox logging, but it's well worth doing it. And then the final thing that I'll bring up today, there's many others, but the final thing I'll bring up today is to buy the advanced security option that is in Office 365. It does give you enhanced conditional access. It gives you some threat monitoring. It gives you some DLP. It gives you tools that are really amazing that we just couldn't have as a small business in the past. And being able to get alerted for impossible travel, and that's one that we'll see. For example, we had a user just the other day. They logged in New York, and then 10 minutes later, they logged in from Florida. Well, the reason why that particular one did, it was a client that has a VPN where a lot of their services are out of a Florida office. Well, this particular user logged in, from New York, 'cause that's where they were at the time. They actually VPN'd and then remoted into a terminal server that was in Florida. So then they appeared to come from Florida. Well, Microsoft said, hey, you can't travel from New York to Florida in 7 minutes. So that's what we call impossible travel. Well, that impossible travel flagged the desk, and in that case, it was fine. There was no problem. But in many cases, that identifies a hacker, because if a hacker is coming from wherever they're coming from, even if it's not a foreign country, which hopefully we've blocked those if we don't need them by conditional access, right? They may be proxying through New York, so it looks like US, but you've got no operations in New York. So when they try to log in as that user from New York, but that user earlier logged in from Florida, well, then our impossible travel filters pick up. So there's a lot of different alerts that come through that advanced security process that is really helpful and gives you real time good information that you can action upon. It also, even if you're going to have a third party manage all this for you, which many of our organizations do, get yourself into some of those monitoring processes, because it's a great way for you to have some oversight into that vendor and make sure they're doing the things that they should be doing and responding to these kind of threats. I talked a long time there, Jason. I want to see if you have some take you back into the real world here.
No, I expected you to hit MFA pretty hard, and you did. But you're right. If it can cut out 70% of potential attacks, why wouldn't you? The one that I always forget what it's called. What's the one where you can have the Microsoft tech, you can lock them out of your environment?
Yeah. You just
I stumped you.
Yeah, no,
well, I think that's the point. There's so many different settings in there. And if you control it, you really want to get in there and understand it and look at everything. And if you don't control it, I think kind of going back to what we talked about earlier, it's so important to make sure that the people you allow to control it know what they're doing, that they didn't just set you up as the standard. What's it called?
Sorry, it just came to me, lockbox. I was like, it was hit me because it doesn't make much sense. So to me, it doesn't make sense. But yeah, lockbox. That's actually a new one they added, I don't know, a couple months ago. But yeah, that's what that does. If you turn on the lockbox on your tenant, it means that if a Microsoft support personnel wants to get into your tenant, they have to ask you for permission. You have to open it or close it when they're in there. But yeah, lockbox. Sorry about that. That it threw me
No
for a loop.
problem.
I couldn't remember the name of it.
So, in moving on, I guess before we do, if you don't know Stephen or me, please know that if you have a question, email us. We'll put our contact up. Give us a phone call. We're happy to try to answer any question. If it's a tough one, push it to Stephen. If it's an easy question, send it to me. But he enjoys talking about this stuff. As you can tell, he kind of lit up and talked for a while there. He's got a lot of real practical experience from actually managing endpoints. And I think we'd be happy to try to answer any question. Just let us know. We'll give our best shot or point you in the direction we need to. One of the two.
That's a great point. We really do enjoy having conversations with clients who are, going through decision-making processes. If you're doing a risk assessment on this, if you want to know how we implement it or how we recommend our clients implement, if you want to know what products we're using, we're always happy to share that with you. We're always happy to have those conversations. It's not, a bill we're trying to send you or any of that kind of thing. But we gather our knowledge by talking to our clients. That's one of the great benefits we can give to you is we can share what we see across multiple organizations. Well, we get that knowledge by having those conversations. So it's very valuable to us. And so we really appreciate when you reach out to us. But if you're considering taking on, whatever software it is or whatever technology it is, please reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you about it. And if it's something we don't know about, we'll be happy to tell you we don't know about it. But, oftentimes we can know another institution that maybe is doing it. There's some way we can connect you to some resources. So yeah, please do that. We really do enjoy it.
With that, we probably ought to get moving on and get finished up here. Just a couple of slides and we'll be done. One that's probably important for you guys is the second CPE code word. It's serendipity. So if you've been following along, there's really been two. There's been salt marsh and serendipity, and that'll be it. And then one last slide, kind of to summarize maybe some parting thoughts. And again, we'll just be restating things that we've sort of said already. But I guess what I would love for you to take from this is it's easy sometimes to kind of be in the weeds and just focus on the change you're making. And it may be important, I think from what we're kind of seeing be said here, it may be important to step back and make sure that one small change in your environment hasn't created a much broader impact than you thought. Looking at your whole environment, you have transitioned something out of your hands into another spot. And it's probably better and faster and safer being in the cloud in many cases, but it's still something that may change the way that you have set up your information security program. The second thing is, I think we would all admit that we're building our expertise along through this process. And I think it benefits you to spend some time, even if you don't intend to ever manage any of these products yourself. And as Stephen mentioned, build your expertise, kind of understand what settings are out there, try to figure out how it is you manage your vendor. I mean, ultimately with a vendor, a lot of times you get a different outcome depending on how closely you manage them. So spend some time building your expertise. That'll allow you better to evaluate your vendors, which ones you want to do business with, which ones you don't. Again, also evaluate your risk group, your audit group. Make sure that you think they've got the expertise. If they don't, send them to school. Send them somewhere to get the expertise they need to be able to help you go through the testing process as well. And incorporate in some of those controls that are new, that are different. Make sure they make their way into the audit program. Make sure they make their way into the audit risk assessment annual and what will be tested. And then the last thing, I think, when things go wrong, it's never good, but I think it's going to be very important for you to be able to kind of tell your story, to be able to look back and say, well, here is how I made my decision. Here are key decision points. Here's documentation and backup, the board guiding me through the process. Here's documentation of me guiding that process along through our implementation. And here's process of audit flowing through that and telling us, so we had a good shape here. Sometimes things happen. It's always good to be able to look back and say, hey, here's the program all the way along the process, and here's a lot of documentation to prove we put our brain on paper. We really thought about it. So with that, if you have any questions for us, as we said before, reach out to us. We're on the website as well. Look us up. Reach out to us, email us, give us a phone call. We'll do our best to try to answer your questions, or just say, hey, we don't know, but we know somebody that knows. Let's put you in touch with them. Any parting thoughts other than that, Stephen?
Nope, that was great. Appreciate your time. And like we said, please reach out. We love having those discussions.
Excellent. So we'll pass it off to Jamie. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.